According to the biblical account, the children of Israel wandered in the desert and mountains of the Sinai Peninsula, moving around and camping in different places for a full 40 years.
After all the plagues happened in Egypt, after all the rods were thrown down on the ground and became serpents, after Moses stretched forth his hand and parted the sea, right? After all these events that helped the Israelites escape out of Egypt, they found themselves wandering in the desert for 40 years, where there was an entire host of other miraculous events that were reported to have taken place. And so what reasoning people want to know is if there is any evidence for these wanderings in the wilderness, or is this just like any other folktale where the evidence only exists in the world of imagination? Well, we're going to find out as we continue reading in the book, The Bible Unearthed by Dr. Israel Finkelstein and Dr. Neil Asher Silberman, to see if we can get some understanding.
Even if the number of fleeing Israelites, given in the text as 600,000, is wildly exaggerated or can be interpreted as representing smaller units of people, the text describes the survival of a great number of people under the most challenging conditions. Some archaeological traces of their generation-long wandering in the Sinai should be apparent.
These scholars are even willing to give the biblical writers a break and say, hey, even if we acknowledge that maybe they greatly overestimated the amount of people that wandered in the wilderness, and maybe it wasn't 600,000, but maybe instead it was smaller units of people that left. Even if that was the case, they're saying that there should be some type of evidence left behind.
However, except for the Egyptian forts along the northern coast, not a single campsite or sign of occupation from the time of Ramesses II and his immediate predecessors and successors has ever been identified in Sinai.
Nothing from that time has been found at any time from all that digging they had done.
And it has not been a lack of trying.
And they have tried and tried a lot. And so a lot of Christians have invested a lot of money to fund these type of excavations with the hopes and dreams that just something of any significance would pop up, right? Because in all honesty, most people, they don't want to hear that what they have been zealously thinking is real is in fact not. And so that's understandable to a degree because it's a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people, right? But archaeologists can only report what they find. And if they haven't found anything, then they just haven't found anything, right? Although they have tried.
Repeated archaeological surveys in all regions of the peninsula, including the mountainous area around the traditional site of Mount Sinai near St. Catherine's Monastery, have yielded only negative evidence.
Here is a map of what these scholars are referring to. And so you can see here is Mount Sinai, where they have repeatedly searched for evidence, but the results have only been negative.
Not even a single sherd, no structure, not a single house, no trace of an ancient encampment.
I mean, they can't make evidence appear if it's not there. At least if we're dealing with honest scholars, which is what we really want, right? And if they found something legitimate, then bring it out because we want to know that too. But the fact that they have found nothing, this speaks volumes.
One may argue that a relatively small band of wandering Israelites cannot be expected to leave material remains behind.
This is assuming that it wasn't 600,000 people that went into the wilderness at once, but rather it was small bands of Israelites. And so if it were small units of Israelites, then much of the evidence shouldn't be expected to be left behind. This is the argument.
But modern archaeological techniques are quite capable of tracing even the very meager remains of hunter-gatherers and pastoral nomads all around the world.
The technology that humans have today is able to trace much smaller groups roaming around the world. So if small groups did wander in the wilderness, they would be able to find it.
Indeed, the archaeological record from the Sinai Peninsula discloses evidence for pastoral activity in such eras as the 3rd millennium BCE and the Hellenistic and Byzantine periods.
Their excavations show evidence of activity between 3000 and 2000 BCE, in the Hellenistic period in the 4th century BCE, and the Byzantine period in the 4th century CE, all which have nothing to do with the time periods of the biblical Exodus.
There is simply no such evidence at the supposed time of the Exodus in the 13th century BCE.
Uh-oh, and so what does this mean?
The conclusion that the Exodus did not happen at the time and in the manner described in the Bible seems irrefutable when we examine the evidence at specific sites where the children of Israel were said to have camped for extended periods during their wandering in the desert, and where some archaeological indication, if present, would almost certainly be found.
The Exodus, the way the Bible describes it, and the time that the Bible places it, did not happen and seems irrefutable, but it's only irrefutable to people who critically examine the evidence. A person who is just a believer, they don't value the evidence, so it doesn't matter what the evidence says, because they're just going to believe it regardless, right? And that's their right to do so. But we all have to know and be clear that these are two completely different approaches to knowledge. And so there are instances where you can use either one of these, right? And you should be aware when it's appropriate to do so, and you also should be aware when you are doing so. And so in this case, we're approaching the topic from a position that critically examines the evidence. And with the technology that we have today, there should certainly be some evidence that supports the biblical claim if it actually did happen the way that the Bible describes it.
According to the biblical narrative, the children of Israel camped at Kadesh Barnea for 38 of the 40 years of the wanderings. The general location of this place is clear from the description of the southern border of the land of Israel in Numbers 34. It has been identified by archaeologists with the large and well-watered oasis of Ain el-Qudarat in eastern Sinai, on the border between modern Israel and Egypt.
So apparently the scholars are clear about where this particular site is located.
Yet repeated excavations and surveys throughout the entire area have not provided even the slightest evidence for activity in the late Bronze Age, not even a single sherd left by a tiny fleeing band of frightened refugees.
Repeated digging in the entire area, digging with all their might and soul, and still not the slightest evidence to prove the biblical narrative. We have to take this into consideration.
Etzion Geber is another place reported to be a camping place of the children of Israel. It's mentioned in other places in the Bible as a later port town on the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, has led to its identification by archaeologists at a mound located on the modern border between Israel and Jordan, halfway between the towns of Eilat and Aqaba.
Right here is where this is located on the map. Take a look at it.
Excavations here in the years 1938 to 1940 revealed impressive late Iron Age remains, but no trace whatsoever of late Bronze occupation.
Nothing found at this site either during the late Bronze Age.
From the long list of encampments in the wilderness, Kadesh Barnea and Etzion Geber are the only ones that can safely be identified, yet they revealed no trace of the wandering Israelites.
And remember that Kadesh Barnea is where they reportedly encamped for 38 years out of the 40. So this site right here should be the most abundant with evidence.
And what of other settlements and peoples mentioned in the account of the Israelites' wanderings? The biblical narrative recounts how the Canaanite king of Arad, who dwelt in the Negev, attacked the Israelites and took some of them captive, enraging them to the point that they appealed for divine assistance to destroy all the Canaanite cities. Almost 20 years of intensive excavations at the site of Tel Arad, east of Beersheba, have revealed remains of a great early Bronze Age city, about 25 acres in size, and an Iron Age fort, but no remains whatsoever from the late Bronze Age, when the place was apparently deserted.
Again, nothing found during this time period.
The same holds true for the entire Beersheba Valley. Arad simply did not exist in the late Bronze Age. The same situation is evident eastward across the Jordan, where the wandering Israelites were forced to do battle at the city of Heshbon, capital of Sihon, king of the Amorites, who tried to block the Israelites from passing in his territory on their way to Canaan. Excavations at Tel Haspon, south of Amman, the location of ancient Heshbon, showed that there was no late Bronze city, not even a small village there. And there is more here.
Come on with it.
According to the Bible, when the children of Israel moved along the Transjordan Plateau, they met and confronted resistance not only in Moab, but also from the full-fledged states of Edom and Ammon. Yet we now know that the plateau of Transjordan was very sparsely inhabited in the late Bronze Age. In fact, most parts of this region, including Edom, which is mentioned as a state ruled by a king in the biblical narrative, were not even inhabited by a sedentary population at that time. To put it simply, archaeology has shown us that there were no kings of Edom there for the Israelites to meet.
That's what archaeology has shown, which is different from what someone's imagination has shown.
The pattern should have become clear by now. Sites mentioned in the Exodus narrative are real. A few were well known and apparently occupied in much earlier periods and much later periods, after the kingdom of Judah was established, when the text of the biblical narrative was set down in writing for the first time.
The people writing these narratives are doing it at a much later time than when these events are supposed to have taken place, which is one of the reasons why they're describing people living in places at a time when nobody lived there. right? They just didn't know.
Unfortunately, for those seeking a historical exodus, they were unoccupied precisely at the time they reportedly played a role in the events of the wandering of the children of Israel in the wilderness.
And there you have it. Thus saith the archaeological evidence. And one thing I know is that it's difficult for many people to accept because of the way that they have been conditioned to believe things since a child, right? And it was difficult for me at one point too. But letting go of religion, and more specifically the literal interpretation of the Bible, was one of the best things that ever happened to me in my entire life, right? And so during that process, I was able to climb rung by rung out of that pit, right? And I was able to witness with my own eyes the free world. And then I was able to realize that in the free world, life is much better and it makes much more sense, right? And so this is the end of part 7 commentary on the book, The Bible Unearthed by Dr. Israel Finkelstein and Dr. Neil Asher Silberman. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.